welcome to Crossover. I'm Yi Shu in Beijing, filling in for Ji Xiaojun, and with me are again David and Mika. Welcome back.
Thank you.
Well, yesterday we talked about, we just scratched the surface talking about
the tiger
mother. Talking about Amy Chua's tiger mother parenting. And whether or not you agree or disagree with Amy Chua, I think the thing is, and what her article, what her book has done for the U.S. is it's helped the U.S. and the rest of the world think about education and parenting and the differences and what's the best. And maybe there isn't one best system, but maybe it's actually pieces of each one that's going to become a great education for our children.
Probably, yeah. Especially since, each country has different situation. The Chinese, they call it the guoqing, the different national situation. Yeah. And just one, as an example, is in China, they have very few people get to go to college. The college entrance exams are very, very strict, and very, very tiny minority, well, it's getting more and more, but a tiny minority get to go to college. So that puts a lot of emphasis on that entrance exam. Yeah, now, that's just, for better or worse, that's just a fact of life. Right. But in the U.S., you don't have that pressure. I mean, you can get into some college at some point. So there's not that, all-encompassing,
the
importance
pressure,
on that. Yeah. Right. So, I mean, you can say, for good or bad, the Chinese educational system gets molded in that direction toward taking that test. Is that good or bad? Well, the child needs that to survive, or that's, a key to success. So that's
right, that is the key to success, pretty much, here in China these days. Right. And compounded with the fact that Chinese traditionally, there's even an idiom that goes something like this in English. It means, you hope your child to become a dragon. Right. Which basically means you want your child to be, offspring to be powerful and strong, and so you'll do whatever you can to get them there, right?
And combine that with the one-child policy,
right?
And you get some really dedicated parents.
Sure, absolutely. And so that the academics and the pressure just starts so early on. We talked yesterday about the Nanjing father who, for his 7-year-old, he has such a strict schedule. Yeah. Basically scheduling every single minute of his son's life.
I don't think that it's all wrong. Like I was saying yesterday, I think having the schedule there in place for the child is really important. But I think the consequences are what's so critical. The ripping up the homework in front of the child. He doesn't get 100 on his homework, or there are some mistakes here or there, and the dad rips it up. I can't see in any world how that could be beneficial to the child. I can't see that. Making them do it over, okay, fine. Having them, even though I don't believe in this as a teaching technique, having them do the problem that they got wrong over and over again. Those are things that, would sit a little bit better with me than ripping up the child's work. Because what does that say to me? That it's not important. And I can only imagine as a 7-year-old, and at least initially, maybe he's used to it now, that first time that happening, thinking, that was all my work. For me, I mean, even when I was in graduate school, I'd write a paper, my advisor would tell me that this, that, and the other thing was wrong with it, and I'd have to go redo it. That was hard for me to hear, and he wasn't my parent. So I can only imagine what it's like for this 7-year-old to see that happening in front of him.
And also, this brings out something that you have to realize, that kids are not just learning what we're explicitly trying to tell them to learn. They're also learning the whole thing. It's a whole package. They're learning about life. They're learning about ways of being. They're learning about ways of not being. Right. They're learning about what works and doesn't work. They're learning about things that hurt and things that make you feel good, and so on and so forth. And a lot of things that they learn are negative lessons. And they're going to come away from it saying, I don't want to be like my dad. He was ridiculous. He was a psychopath, and that's something they learned. Sure. They learned that more than they learned what the father was trying to teach them, with these methods. So I mean, things like violence. That's why, is spanking good or bad? Do you want to teach kids by making them feel pain and spank them with violence? Is that the solution? So these are all questions. You have to take into account that for kids, everything is learning.
Right.
The first time they go to school, it's not just a matter of they're getting math and science. They're learning how to be people in the context. They're learning about boys and girls and adults and children. They're learning about freedom, They're learning about consequences of doing something bad, and so on and so forth.
There's been an interesting survey, and this is comparing Western and Chinese immigrant perspectives towards education. Because in one study, 50 Western American mothers and 48 Chinese immigrant mothers were surveyed. Almost 70% of the Western mothers said that stressing academic success is not a good thing for the children. They don't want to stress academic success. And that parents need to foster the idea that learning is fun. It's back to what you said in the last show, that there's this movement that everything should be fun, right? By contrast, almost 0% of the Chinese mothers felt the same way. Instead, they said, and these are
Zero?
That's amazing. What I have is roughly 0%. It says that they believe their children can be the best students and that academic achievement reflects. Now, see, this is so funny. Academic achievement reflects successful parenting. So this is back to the lose face sort of thing that you were saying, right? And that if the children did not excel at school, then there was a problem, and the parents were not doing their job. The parents see it as a responsibility, and that responsibility is for their children to get A's, not B's, A's. And if they didn't get them, that's a reflection on the parents. Very different type of perspective.
Yeah, very stark.
Yeah. Right.
It also reminds me of one of my teachers and mentors at University of Michigan, a guy named Harold Stevenson, who did a lot of cross-cultural work on psychology between Chicago kids and Taiwan, mainland, Hong Kong, and so forth. And one of the questions they asked was a survey, asked parents, what constitutes a good child? And then they have a list of attributes. And, diligence, cooperation, creativity, hard work, so on and so forth, a dozen or more attributes. Interestingly, and it's the same kind of stark distribution, was that the American parents put creativity very high on the list, like sometimes number one. And the Asian parents, and especially the mainland parents, put creativity like way at the bottom. And when you question them, well, why do you put creativity so close to the bottom? Creativity? How can a child be creative? What's the point? Childhood is for learning skills, and then you grow up, you can be creative. Why do I want my child to be creative? And so it's the same idea. The whole idea of what they're, how to teach the child are almost diametrically opposed at times. Yeah.
Right. I mean, for Asian parents, it's all about the grade. It's all about the numbers, right?
The numbers.
It's the numbers, and maybe that's perpetuated by the educational system, right? Like because we are geared towards numbers. We're geared towards examination, as you said.
Yeah.
And I think. Really, Chinese parents, they demand good grades because they feel like, their kids can get them. I'll be honest with you. Again, my poor kids, because I do think my kids should be able to get A's because, after all, I got them. Okay, my husband didn't get them, but I got them. So if they don't get them, it's my husband's fault. But, I know I'm going to have high expectations for them. Some parents will punish, they'll shame the child if they need to, but it's not because they don't love them. It's just because they want the best for them. Yeah?
Of course. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, don't all parents want the best for their kids? And, I think the grades, I think those numbers reflect something, which is that you see here in China, they almost see education as providing tools to the child. So, of course, creativity is low on the list. If they don't have the tools, how can they be creative?
Right.
I remember a trigonometry exam that we had in high school where we just had to write out like 198 equations, just the basic equations, and you could derive them all from the first four or something. Obviously, I remembered this very well. You could derive them all, but you didn't have time. We had to do it in 40 minutes or something. So either you had them memorized or you didn't. And did that mean that you understood what you were doing? No. None of us understood what we were doing, I don't think. But we could all write out those 100 and however many equations, and then later on, and it was so funny because it's like a light bulb goes off in your head. Oh yeah, I know how to do this because, hey, guess what? I've got that. And, and I have that tool. And
it's interesting that you remember this even, decades later, right?
Well, when my sister and I were learning crosstalk, Chinese dialogue, comic dialogue, we memorized the scripts using Hanyu Pinyin, and we learned all the responses, everything we were supposed to say, and had no idea what we were saying. And I'm sure, I know people explained it to us, but we didn't really know. And it was funny later on, you know, in university, if you went over a script in your head, because of course we still remembered them, we had practiced them so much, all of a sudden it's like, oh, yeah, I know those words now. I get it. That's what we were saying. Oh, that makes sense. That's really funny.
So the understanding comes later.
But the understanding was coming later, yeah.
Right. So drilling, it does work, but yeah, but you don't reap the value from it until later. Okay, we're going to talk more about educational systems when we come back. Stay tuned. And welcome back to Crossover. So we're talking about drilling exercises into your children as an educational technique or as a learning technique.
Yeah.
I don't think it can stop there. I mean, I think it's important to see those things really only as tools and to help your kids put those tools to good use.
Right. And I think it is something that is very, I want to say, a preferred method, maybe even here in China. You can't call that a Chinese technique. In fact, after school, there's been this phenomenon in China, all throughout Asia actually, and it's the phenomenon of what's called in Chinese the 补习班, the tutoring centers.
Yep.
I mean, this has become big business. Western countries probably don't understand this as much because what happens is after the child comes out of school, they go into a tutoring center where they're going to be tutored on the core academic subjects like math and science and English. English is a big one. You know, we're looking at some pictures here actually of a tutoring center. Here's a child learning violin. They're learning the piano. There was a picture previously. They were learning calligraphy. And what I'm hearing from a lot of the Chinese parents is one of the reasons why they'll do some of these extracurricular activities like piano and violin is because when it comes to the college examination, they get added points if they reach a certain level. So again, it comes back to this very, very rigorous college examination.
Right. It all geared toward the
all geared towards one day, or actually a few days of a child's life.
Yeah.
It's just a lot of stress
It's
for
a lot
an
of stress.
18-year-old.
Yeah.
A lot of stress.
There's, getting back to this idea of rote memorization, which the Chinese educational system is always accused of that. It is true to some extent. It deserves that reputation in some sense, and you would know better than I would.
But we memorized a lot.
You memorized a lot, yeah. But in some other ways, it doesn't deserve that reputation totally, partly because there's some good things about rote memorization. For example, their approach to language is very often, drill, but you repeat the same sentence over and over again. Sometimes just reading stuff out loud. Like you say, you don't even understand what you're reading. They'll pick up a book. I used to see students on the campus where I used to teach walking around in the early morning hours with a book in hand, just shouting out loud, and it wasn't the crazy English thing either. They were just reading and if you ask, what's the point of that? What does it do? Well, part of speaking language is using your muscles and doing these things, the pronunciation, over and over again. And that's part of speaking. And the only way you can get that, as with any muscle, is you have to train the muscle.
The muscle memory, right? Yeah.
And the only way you can do that is you can't just say, oh, good, you understand the grammar point. Now we can go on to something else. Understanding is not the same thing as executing and being able to do it. There's an understanding of the concept, and there's the ability to actually perform it. And since language is one of these performative things, you want to be able to do it very quickly. So it makes perfect sense to drill that way. If you really want to speak well, that's the only way you can do it, right?
Sure.
But then there are other things that don't involve that. That drilling is useless, a worthless waste of time. But even with math, because I went around with my Professor Stevenson and looked at some of the Chinese math classes, and one of the differences was there was a lot of rote, there was a lot of drill. I mean, everything they did a million times. But at the same time, the teachers were usually math majors who liked math, enjoyed math, and they also they used a lot more verbal problems and put the things in context. The kids were really learning math in China.
Right,
here in China,
right,
they were really learning good math, and they were learning the concepts and along with the drill.
Right.
So I mean, you can't deny that the Chinese has that slant or that sort of thing, but there's good things about it.
I have read that in China, the math teachers are math majors, whereas in other countries, in the U.S.,
they're PE teachers who also teach math.
Until they get to a certain level, right?
Especially with the budget cuts.
Sure, of course.
But I think, the Chinese language in and of itself lends itself to that. I mean, you have how many thousands of characters?
Right.
The only way to learn those characters is by repetition and rote memorization. So in order to even be able to read and write, you have to be good at memorization, period. It's not like English where, you learn some spelling rules and you can pretty much sound out words. And if not, there's always spell check. I mean, it's really, you have to know what you're doing with Chinese characters. And that's what makes it such a hard language to learn as an adult. I wish, we didn't start learning how to read and write until we had been in China for 6 or 7 years. And I wish we had started earlier. But again, my mom wanted us to love speaking Chinese and to really enjoy being here. And, we do. And so I think in that sense, it was extremely successful. I don't read and write nearly as well as I could.
Well, let me ask you something, because of course you went to you were schooled for the most part here in China.
Yeah.
Yes, and so that meant you encountered a lot of this drilling, the rote memorization, and yet you came out superbly. You're a success. So, sample size of 1.
Yeah, but I would say, I went back to the States for university. I went to Brown, and the hardest thing for me the first year was allowing myself to have an opinion. And so you'd be in a small discussion group. I remember going to a TA afterwards and saying, I wanted to bring this up, but I didn't think it was appropriate. And he looked at me and he said, that's exactly what we were talking about. That's fascinating. Why didn't you say anything? And I sort of looked at him and I was like, oh, well, I didn't think I should. And so it was one of these things where what I had to say was so far outside the box of what we were talking about in class, I didn't feel like I could. Right. And in that sense, I think that's maybe where the education styles really differ.
That's interesting. That's something that's so long-term, that just from your exposure to the Chinese educational system.
Yeah.
Right.
Wow.
We're going to talk more about Western and Chinese educational systems when we come back. Don't go away. Welcome back to Crossover. So we talked about this in yesterday's show. You mentioned it actually in the beginning of the show, this exam that was done last year. It was actually called the PISA exam, the Program for International Student Assessment.
Okay,
and it was done around the world, done by a global organization. And it was the first year that Shanghai participated in this exam. And it's basically an exam to survey, to evaluate the level of education that children are receiving throughout countries. So they actually think it's a very good study. Shanghai came out #1. It surprised everybody. First time taking the exam, surprised everybody. U.S. in the 20s, I think, 24, 26, somewhere around there. Actually, I have the exact number here. It was American students ranked 26th. Tough for the U.S. given that they are a superpower.
Yes, but no other countries went, that's okay, that's very good, U.S.
Right.
You'll do better next time. No one helped our self-image at all. I mean, this is we lost a lot of face because of this.
Yes, and it was a wake-up call. I mean, even the Secretary of Education said this is a huge wake-up call. They've called it Sputnik. Like, this is going to be, this is the threshold, and now maybe things are going to change in the U.S. But it does also say something about the Chinese educational system. They're good test takers. I'm interested in hearing what you think about what that says about China.
Oh boy, that's a deep question.
Yeah.
China has always, Chinese culture puts a great emphasis on education, definitely.
Even historically, if you go to the Confucian Temple in Nanjing, for example, you can see all the little stalls where the imperial scholars went and were boarded in for 3 days with, their food and where they took their exams. And, we don't have that kind of history in the States for sure. I mean, partly because our history is a lot shorter, and partly because, we just don't have that sort of background. So it's, there's a long historical tradition here of that type of education. It's not like it's suddenly sprang up out of nowhere. I mean, there's a long history of that. So.
Yeah. And because of some of these historical and also just contemporary economic and social conditions, there's a great emphasis not only just on education, but on practical education, results-oriented education, and education that's going to lead to, jobs, and quite frankly, the things like infrastructure, and right at the stage where China needs. They need mathematicians, they need engineers, they need technical experts in all fields, they need people who really have real ability, in these areas. And the U.S. is in a completely different place historically. And for a long time, especially when I was going to school, so much emphasis on the softer sciences and the softer fields, and including things, art and innovation and drama and things like that. So I mean,
so maybe
it may be that all these things again are continuums. It may be that as time went on, the U.S. has fallen further and further behind. Maybe some other social problems too with the educational system.
Sure.
China is going strong educationally, for sure, and it always has been.
I think people still think that America has the best universities, but when it comes to primary and secondary education, I do think, a lot of American people are very, very upset about, my friends back in the U.S. are very upset with the quality of education. And I think this, again, is a wake-up call.
And the universities are, especially at the graduate level, are increasingly filled with Asians and people that are not American.
Sure.
There's even a whole website called Asians Sleeping in the Library or something, where the idea is that all of these Asian students
are in the library.
And it's true. When I was at University of Michigan, we had this computer function called Finger, and you could just figure out, you could press this button and see who's online in the university system. And after midnight, you would see who's online right now, and it was all Zhang, Li, Wen, Chinese names. And all the Americans had got off the party, and the Chinese were still on, doing their work. So I mean, there is something, even at the university level.
And it goes back to the hard work. You have to put in a lot of work and effort to gain.
Right.
Yeah, and I think, when you're brought up that way, when in elementary school you have to work so hard to get into a good middle school, and, middle school to high school to college, by the time you're in university, certainly the students who make it to the States know how to work.
Right, that's right.
And whereas, I think our... elementary school certainly is a lot more lax, and then middle school and high school as well. And so you get to university, and I saw this in some of my friends in the States. You get there, and I'm going, okay, it's Friday night, but we've got a test on Monday, so let's go study.
Yeah.
You can tell us the life of the party, right?
Boring.
See you in the library, we're going to go.
You'll be fine. Grand Sunday night. No, but, at the same time, I also had a lot of friends who helped me out a lot because I wasn't used to studying in English. And for me, it did take quite a bit longer than it took for them to get through the material.
Right. And I think actually going to a university is a tough transition for a lot of American students. Going from high school to university it's tough. Because they demand more in a university.
Right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Well, and I think for anyone it's a shift because you're moving away from home. You're having to deal with a whole host of developmental and educational changes.
Right.
And in the States it's even worse because you're going from this sort of, what is it they say, senioritis?
Yeah.
You've taken your test, you've gotten into university, you don't really need to do much your second semester of senior year to get by. My roommate in high school made her, I think it was her physics teacher, sorry, my roommate in college made her physics teacher really mad her second semester of senior year because she just brought in a little notebook and took minimal notes all semester.
All you need to do is pass your class. Yeah,
right? And, she was going to Brown. Clearly she wasn't stupid, but she was in. Sure. So why work?
Right.
And then you go back and go back to school and you're slammed with a lot of work.
Right.
It's a tough transition.
There's also a way in which the two educations, the college education systems differ. In Chinese, when you start on a course of, say you're doing microbiology or something, you stay with that for the whole 4 years to graduate. None of this stuff like we have in the U.S. Like, I'm going to change majors. I want to do psych instead or something else, right? And some people, go through 4 or 5 majors by the time they get their PhD or something. Not in China. It's rigorous. You stick to one major.
Or in Europe either, too. I think they have you go in and you sort of specialize, and that's what you're doing.
Things are starting to change in China, and I want to talk about this one individual. His name is Zheng Yuanjie, and he is considered the king of fairy tales in China. He is more popular in China than Harry Potter books.
Really?
And specifically, there's a book that he wrote called Pipi Lulu Shishi. It's got a little kitschy little rhythm to it, yeah. Very, very popular amongst children. And when his son was in primary school, he stopped formal schooling, and he decided, that's his son right there with him, he decided to put his son and into homeschooling program, his own homeschooling program. And the reason why, and this is interesting, because he says that while his son was studying in 3rd grade in primary school, his teacher gave him a homework assignment, and he had to write an essay. So his father, who's this illustrious, prolific writer, wrote the essay for him. First of all, that's cheating.
That's cheating.
But second of all, I'm not sure what the motivation was to do it, but he thought, okay, well, he'll get a great score. Again, back to getting good grades,
getting
right? So he
face.
thought, okay, he'll get an excellent score.
Yeah.
But the teacher said, this is very bad writing. It's a very weird subject. Isn't that great? So he was totally shocked. So then they had the family's nanny write an essay for the son, and it came back with an A. He said, this is great. So after that, he said he completely doubted the value of the traditional Chinese educational system, and he started a homeschooling program. He wrote the teaching materials all on his own. I believe they're actually available now on the market. But his son is actually a very successful businessman today. So
this is a father who's dissatisfied with the Chinese educational system.
And I think actually there's a movement amongst more progressive, some progressive Chinese artists. That sort of a community.
And you're right. A lot of parents. There's now a market for things like Montessori schools. That even Chinese parents are attracted to this model. You probably know more about that than I do.
I don't know much about it at all. I mean, I know about the different models, and over the summer last year, I was at a friend's house, and her children were going to what's called a Waldorf school, where they actually write their own textbooks. And she was showing me the textbooks that her kids had written through the years, and it was fascinating. But as I was looking at it, I thought, wow, I couldn't imagine having that sort of activity or assignment in school here growing up.
Back to your comments about having some sort of a routine for children, making them feel secure. I mean, that's really for them to develop their own curriculum and their own textbooks that's quite... Well